who was terrific with us last time on wargaming. And today he's going to give a lecture on extended deterrence, which has always been a key element of U.S. alliance strategy with NATO and with other U.S. allies. Just a quickie, Brad, as you remember, is a Stanford grad. You're not actually from the Bay Area, are you? You're from...
No, Southern California.
Oh, really? I didn't know.
Well, my family moved to Malibu when I was 10 from the Chicago suburbs.
Oh,
so I did grammar school in Malibu, high school in Carpinteria, south of Santa Barbara, and then 4 years at Stanford and 3 years of working at Stanford, and then a year at the World Affairs Council of Northern California before heading off to the London School of Economics.
Right, right. And then you got a PhD at Erasmus University in the Netherlands.
Right.
And returned to various think tanks, the Congressional Research Service, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. And then was selected by the Obama administration to play a key role on nuclear policy and missile defense. And became the point person for the basically interaction of and sort of selling the Obama policies to the allies. And about 5 years ago, went to Livermore as the director of the Center for Global Security Research, where he's done a fantastic job. They publish a ton of stuff and have fascinating workshops all the time on a whole range of national security issues, most of which deal with nuclear weapons, but not all. There's cyber and there's chemical and biological too. So Brad, welcome back. You're almost like a regular part of the group here, and we look forward to your remarks on extended deterrence.
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to join you. And I think you described the week or the semester as bizarre. And I hope I can add some color to your bizarre semester being part of the bizarre show.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, your point about my role in the Office of the Secretary of Defense when we were both there was very much to remind people about extended deterrence in an American community that's inclined to neglect it. And in fact, as I'll argue, there was a particular interest that President Obama brought that drove extended deterrence to a very high place of interest through the nuclear posture review that I helped run. And that interest continued on into the Trump administration, but of course in a different way. And now there's an important question about how much of a priority there really is for the Biden administration in this area, where it faces a tough choice between its desire to declare the sole purpose formulation of declaratory policy that would be an action widely seen by its allies as weakening extended deterrence. And so it has a choice between, I mean, this is the dilemma of public policy. You have to make a choice between often competing priorities, and here are the choices between supporting allies and declaring sole purpose. And we'll see how it plays out. And I'll say a little more about that. What I thought I'd do to introduce the subject is to talk first about the concept of extended deterrence, then secondly, to talk about its changing place in our overall nuclear strategy and defense strategy, but to third, spend the bulk of my time on emerging challenges to extended deterrence. The concept, first of all, well, you've done the reading in the book, so let me not belabor the point, but extended deterrence is a form of protection provided to an ally that services two different audiences. One is the ally, And the extended nuclear deterrent is aimed at assuring that the vital interests of that ally will not be put in jeopardy by any actor. But the other audience is the adversary, or the prospective adversary, or the potential adversary, or the aggressor, whatever label we're using at the time. And here the purpose of extended nuclear deterrence is not assurance, but it's deterrence and the prevention of aggression, and equally importantly, negating coercion. So extended nuclear deterrence actually has these multiple functions. How is deterrence extended from one country to another? Well, two basic means: declaratory policy and technical means. Declaratory policy, as you know, is the set of statements made by American political and military leaders, but fundamentally political leaders, about the conditions under which they might or would not ever consider the employment of nuclear weapons. And clear and consistent statements from American political leadership are highly valued by US allies as the primary means of extending deterrence. Then there are the technical means, the ability to actually implement a threat if you have to make good on it. And here the technical means for extending deterrence are both conventional and nuclear. Deterrence by denial, as it's called, the ability to deny North Korea or Russia or China victory at the conventional level of war is an essential part of deterrence. But it's not the full part of deterrence, because they have the means to escalate their way out of a failed conventional war. And we, the United States, would greatly prefer to extend nuclear deterrence to our allies with the triad alone. But for many of our allies, for most of our allies, this isn't good enough, because the threat to employ, well, because of the core problem with extended nuclear deterrence, which Schelling put his finger on 60 years ago, which is that's one country making a threat to another country to protect a third, and promising that it's willing to run the risk of losing one of its own cities or more, even if it doesn't have a dog in the fight, except the interest of the ally. So it's essentially saying, I'm willing to risk nuclear suicide to defend another country. And our allies have to wonder, is this really so? Is America really willing, when the chips are down and the risks are high, and maybe we can decouple the United States from the defense of its allies by raising the risks beyond America's willingness to bear them. Decoupling was a central idea of Soviet strategy in Europe. And it's, of course, what North Korea and Iran are after today, in seeking the ability to put the American homeland at risk, so that in time of war in the region, we, the United States, would choose not to act in defense of an ally. So if you accept that there's this credibility problem at the heart of extended nuclear deterrence, then America's promise to extend nuclear deterrence just with its strategic triad doesn't look very appealing to you. Our European allies, very much when they felt most threatened by the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 60s, very much wanted American nuclear weapons present in the region, the way that many Japanese and South Koreans would like there to be more visible and tangible displays of America's ability to put nuclear weapons back into the theater, as we have promised to do in time of crisis or war. And the value of having a forward deployable capability, as it's called, is a little bit dependent on the region, but in both Europe and Asia, there are some allies who believe that, well, let's take Kim Jong-un as an example. He's not really going to worry about the threat that America might launch a ballistic missile out of some hole in the ground in the middle of Montana. He can't see it. He has got no reason to believe that the threat is real. But if there's an American nuclear weapon at an air base in South Korea that he's monitoring closely, he can see that weapon. And he can understand that if he attempts to attack it, it might well get fired at him. So the argument some allies make is that there's a psychological credibility to a locally available nuclear weapon that simply doesn't exist for one that's somewhere far, far away in the middle of America and not visible. NATO has a more formal way of expressing this. The North Atlantic Treaty expresses the idea that American military power is essential to the preservation of peace and stability in Europe, and the ability to project power across the Atlantic serves as the link, the transatlantic link, that keeps American defense and military strategy tied to the European theater. And nuclear weapons are the most important symbol of that link. And take them away, and having served that role for 60 years, take them away and people are going to wonder, well, what happened to your political commitment to your allies? There's also the element of the North Atlantic Treaty that says the allies will consider an attack on one as an attack on all. And part of the function of the nuclear sharing arrangements at NATO is to demonstrate that that's true, that Russia would not be able to attack a single member of NATO with nuclear weapons and hope that no other nuclear weapon held by another state would come back in response. By attacking one state, Mr. Putin is running the risk of being retaliated against by many. So an attack on one being an attack on all. The forward deployable capabilities thus having a particularly important role in dealing with the credibility issue of extended nuclear deterrence. So if there are these two different audiences, allies and adversaries, various means, political and military technical, if there's the problem of credibility at the core of the extended deterrence relationship, we need also to think about the failures of all of these things. What would the failure of extended nuclear deterrence mean? Well, it would mean the coercion of US allies at the very least by nuclear threats. It could mean war, including a war that escalates badly from our perspective because an adversary has miscalculated our resolve to defend our interests. But a failure of extended nuclear deterrence wouldn't be a localized event. As the United States has allies in 3 regions of the world and over 40 countries, a failure of extended nuclear deterrence in any one part of that landscape would affect all of the landscape. Thus, when we think about the failures of extended nuclear deterrence, we must also think about potential nuclear tipping points. I hope you've read about tipping points this semester, where a system threshold is crossed and a cascade of proliferation follows. And these cascades are easy to imagine. Thus, extended nuclear deterrence isn't just a part of our deterrence strategy, it's also a part of our non-proliferation strategy. So that's some introductory thoughts on the concept and practice of extended nuclear deterrence. Let me talk about its place in our strategy, our nuclear strategy, our defense strategy more generally. In the Cold War, extended nuclear deterrence, well, that's what deterrence started being all about. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, deterrence was all about extending US nuclear protection into Europe to prevent Soviet aggression against the democracies. At the end of the Cold War, well, then came the big buildup of strategic forces in the 1960s, the missile race, the missile anti-missile race, the big buildup of the 1980s, and people, and the extended nuclear deterrence subject became overshadowed by these other factors. It didn't go away, but it was no longer in the central place in nuclear strategy and defense strategy. And then with the end of the Cold War, it simply went away as a topic of interest. The Cold War ended, as you know, with the presidential nuclear, it ended in the nuclear realm with the presidential nuclear initiatives of the early 1990s. I assume you've studied those. But from an extended nuclear deterrence perspective, the presidential nuclear initiatives had a huge impact. Under the PNIs, all of the US nuclear weapons in Asia were withdrawn and mostly destroyed, dismantled and destroyed. And that included the missiles on, the nuclear weapons deployed on all naval surface ships and on any land facility. And the presidential nuclear initiatives in Europe withdrew 97% of the number of nuclear weapons that were in place in 1990. So in this decade after the Cold War, there was a complete remaking of the US nuclear umbrella as provided to our two allies. And reflecting this big shift in thinking in the downplaying of interest in extended nuclear deterrence was the fact that the first nuclear posture review in 1994 mentions extended deterrence twice, and essentially as an afterthought, both times. Then came the George W. Bush administration, which sought to re-emphasize the place of alliances in US security strategy. This had something to do with the war on terror, and which was called GWAT, the Global War on Terror. And if you were thinking globally about the war on terror, you wanted every ally you could find everywhere. So alliances and allies took a more central place. And so the four defense policy goals as set out by the George W. Bush administration were assure, dissuade, deter, defeat. Assure came first, and that was about assurance of allies, that the United States would stand with them and protect them, even in the face of WMD threats from rogue states. But the George W. Bush administration went down in history as being pretty rough on US allies. The relationship didn't improve. And President Obama arrived, and you all know the Prague speech. But shortly after the Prague speech, the North Korean leader sent his thank you gift to President Obama, which was his first underground nuclear explosion. And a short time thereafter, President Obama had two phone calls. The president of South Korea and the prime minister of Japan. And I didn't hear them personally, but I understand from people who did that they ran roughly as follows. Mr. President, lovely speech in Prague. And really, if there's anything we can do to help you achieve the long-term goal of eliminating nuclear weapons, we would love that, because it would make a material difference in our neighborhood. Our interest in disarmament is real. That, by the way, is how South Korea came to host the second Nuclear Materials Security Summit in the Obama run of 7 of those summits. But oh, by the way, Mr. President, on the way to fulfilling your Prague vision, are you going to close what's left of your already tattered nuclear umbrella? Because if you do that, we may have to look after our own needs, and it's not clear that you will have reduced the role of nuclear weapons at all. And a year later, when it came time to roll out the nuclear posture review, the president, I had phone calls to make, Michael had phone calls to make, we had briefing slides to release, we had all of these things, a long to-do list when you roll out a big government report. But there were two things on the list that Obama had to do, and they were call those two guys and report back and say, here's what we've done to strengthen extended deterrence. And I use the word strengthen very purposefully. Those two phone calls in late April of, or May of, no, it was late April of 2009, came at a time when the White House staff was deliberating the guidance to give to us to do the nuclear posture review. And when it came to extended deterrence, there was a discussion underway about what verb to put in the guidance. Was the Obama administration committed to maintaining extended deterrence, changing extended deterrence, not weakening extended deterrence, but reducing the role of nuclear weapons in extended deterrence? The answer to that was yes. It decided that it was interested in strengthening, quote unquote, extended deterrence. So we were told, go off and come up with options for reducing the role of nuclear weapons in the protection of our allies, but strengthen extended deterrence. That was an interesting circle to try to square. And my personal assessment is that 7 years later, our allies were troubled by various things, but they did not have serious doubts about the will of the United States or its ability to employ nuclear weapons on their behalf in the circumstances, in the extreme circumstances when their most vital interests are at risk. They did not feel that they would be abandoned in crisis, which is at the core of assurance. That changed, of course, over the subsequent 4 years. It changed immediately when it was clear that President Trump was considering withdrawing from alliances and speaking publicly about, well, it would be just fine if American allies got nuclear weapons. That would be lightening the burden on us. And I would say at the end of his 4 years, there's been hope that the pendulum would swing back and stay swung back with a central place for allies. And as I've already foreshadowed, I think the tea leaves, as the Biden administration has set them out, are troublesome from the perspective of an ally looking at the United States, seeking assurance that the nuclear umbrella that the United States maintains on their behalf will be credibly threatened and will be effective if ever employed. And why do I say mixed messages? Well, on the one hand, the president has said he's committed to strengthening the relationship with allies and alliances. And he's committed to ensuring that deterrence remains safe, secure, and effective, including extended deterrence to US allies. But he didn't use the word nuclear in that sentence. He did use the word nuclear in the next sentence. This is in the interim guidance. Actually, I should quote it. This is the, presumably you've seen this, the interim national security strategic guidance. You're nodding your heads yes. So, but here's the order of. Now imagine you're Mansouk, sitting in Seoul, worried about the North Korean nuclear threat that's grown steadily in the time Mansouk has been sitting here in California drinking Chardonnay and not protecting his homeland. And the new president arrives who's committed to strengthening your alliance and your protection. And his nuclear agenda is, we're going to head off on a costly arms race with Russia. Great. Okay. How does that help South Korea? Not much. Where possible, we'll pursue new arms control arrangements. Well, maybe there's something there with North Korea, but I don't think so, and they don't say so. We will take steps to reduce the role of nuclear weapons while ensuring that our deterrent remains, our strategic deterrent remains safe, secure, and effective, and that our extended deterrence commitments to our allies remain strong and credible. It doesn't say ensuring our nuclear deterrent remains safe, secure, and effective, which is what the Obama administration said. And it doesn't say that our extended nuclear deterrence commitments to our allies remain strong and credible. They foreshadowed their move to sole purpose and their desire to retire the dual-capable fighter bombers and the ability to forward deploy non-strategic weapons in support of allies and alliances. So maybe I'm reading too much into what they've written. They have written very little on this subject. That in itself is very interesting. But let me stand back from the politics of the moment and say, if I mean, my point in this second part of the lecture is about the place of extended nuclear deterrence in U.S. strategy. And what I want you to carry away with you is an inverse bell curve, that it had a high place, it dipped down low, it's been steadily coming back up since about 2000. Extended nuclear deterrence questions were in a central place in the Obama period, and they remained in a central place in the Trump period. This is basically why the, quote, supplemental capabilities were proposed by the Trump administration to strengthen extended nuclear deterrence in Europe. And why is this so? Why have we gone through this bell-shaped inverse bell curve? And the answer for why we lost focus is pretty clear. Why has it come back? Well, we've rediscovered the fact that alliances are central to the order in which we live. We can't just walk away from our alliances and expect the existing international orders to survive, not just the security order, the trading order, the political relationships. And secondly, we've discovered that our allies are in the crosshairs of our enemies. Kim Jong-un regularly says if he has to ever employ a nuclear weapon, the first one's going on Tokyo. Not on San Francisco, not on Los Angeles, not on New York. Why would he say Tokyo? Well, the conventional, the defense of the Republic of Korea requires South Korean military forces, American forces on the peninsula, and a whole lot of military personnel and equipment sitting at military bases in Japan under the United Nations flag. Their dispatch from Japan requires the approval of the Japanese Prime Minister. The last time that approval was sought, 1950, it was a no-brainer. There was no risk to Japan in this. Kim Jong-un is trying to make it a brainer. He's trying to compel the Japanese public to think, do you want to sacrifice 100,000 or 200,000 people for the defense of these South Korean people you don't really like very much? Think about that. That's the problem of extended nuclear deterrence today. So our allies are in the crosshairs. They are the prize in the wars that might be fought. And I don't mean the prize in the way of conquest and occupation. I mean, very clearly, the leaders of China, Russia, and North Korea are committed to a remaking of regional political orders in a manner that produces states and societies and political classes that are deferential to their interests, whose sovereignty is circumscribed, whose independence of action and thought is constrained by the interests of their major power neighbor. And that's what I mean by being in the crosshairs, not just the military crosshairs, but the crosshairs of strategy. That's the order we're defending, their independence and sovereignty. So if we live in a world of major power rivalry, extended nuclear deterrence is in the middle of the problem set. So I've foreshadowed already my third and final set of arguments about emerging challenges. I will touch briefly on 6 just to get the discussion going. And the first of these is that, as you read in my book, my argument about theories of victory. Russia, China, and North Korea were all presented with the problem of a militarily superior United States, uncounterbalanced by a major power peer. They were confronted with this problem in the 1990s. They had no money. They had very little military technology. They had very meager military forces. What did they have? Lots of smart people. I don't know so much about North Korea in this regard, but Russia and China, lots of smart people. And they put those people on the problem of the war that America might bring to them and how to solve it. And they came up with a body of ideas about how to deter and defeat a conventionally superior nuclear-armed major power and its allies. And I like the term theory of victory as a shorthand here. A set of ideas and some wishful thinking, to be sure, but a set of ideas about how to fight and win, or at least escape with some interest intact, a war against the United States and its allies. And they have a theory of victory in two senses, in the spirit of Clausewitz and Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu's obvious. They'd much rather that they are victorious because we choose not to compete, not to defend, not to confront. But if it comes to it, they're prepared, in the spirit of Clausewitz, to raise our costs, impose new risks on us, to the point where we're no longer willing to run those costs and risks. And Clausewitz called that a culminating point, a culminating political point of a political process. Victory, in his definition, not being when you vanquish your enemy on the battlefield. Victory comes when your enemy chooses to terminate the war on your terms. So my first emerging challenge to extended nuclear deterrence is that Russia, China, and North Korea have developed their theories of victory, and we haven't. They were focused on this problem for 20 plus years before we woke up to it in about, well, between 2011 and 2014. Largely because of China's assertiveness in its maritime environment, but also because of Russia's annexation of Crimea and the revelation that we had really misunderstood the strategic intentions of the leaders in both countries. And only subsequently have we begun to think about the problem of deterring and defeating, or effectively negating their strategies for deterring and defeating us. Carl referred to the lexicon project between the United States and China. One of the important differences we have in our way of thinking about all these problems, we and the Chinese, is on the word deterrence. For the Chinese, it's a very aggressive and coercive term. You know, I've got a plan to do the right thing, and you come along and you grab me by the throat and push me against the wall and nearly kill me in order to prevent me from doing the right thing. That's how they interpret deterrence. And so when pushed early on in the dialogues back in 2000 to 2005, they said, well, we don't have a deterrence strategy. We have a counter-deterrence strategy. You have a deterrence strategy. Our strategy is aimed at countering your strategy by negating all of the advantages you would bring to it. And we can negate your nuclear advantages. We don't need equal numbers to do that. Parity is a condition in which we have an equal strategic potential to damage the other. We can massively destroy the United States. You can massively destroy us. That's parity. So I go through that little catechism because we don't have a counter-deterrence strategy for the theory of victory of our adversaries. We haven't figured out how to counter that yet. We're making more headway than we had made up to 2014 and 2015. But the but the news isn't good on how much headway we're making. There's something called the National Defense Strategy Commission. The Congress requires the executive branch every 4 years produce a review of defense strategy. For a long time, this was called the Quadrennial Defense Review. Now it's just called the National Defense Strategy Review. The Biden administration's just starting one now. And the Congress, when it imposed the obligation on the executive to do these every 4 years, the Congress said to itself, well, we're not a very smart consumer of these strategies, so we need some help. So they created a Congressional Commission on National Defense Strategy. And when the Congress receives the administration strategy, the next thing it does is it turns it around and hands it to the commission and says, please come back in 6 months and tell us what you think. Good strategy, good recommendations, bad recommendations. Should we fund everything they want? Should we fund nothing of what they want? And the National Defense Strategy Commission of 2018 said, great strategy that the Trump people produced. It's focused exactly on this problem that I've set out. The plans of 3 countries, Russia, China, and North Korea, to deter and defeat a conventionally superior nuclear-armed major power and its allies. But you get a failing grade in response, they said, because the reality is if we, the United States and our allies, had to go to war against one of these adversaries at this time, we would lose. We have not prepared to fight at the conventional level of war in a contested environment. We think we're going to be dominant, and we haven't done our thinking at all about how to manage their strategies to escalate and counter-escalate for our strengths. And this could be a catastrophe. It was a damning indictment and quickly forgotten. But I think it hits on the sorry state of our extended deterrence posture, broadly defined. So I'm talking about, so if the first challenge to extended deterrence was the arrival of red theories of victory of the kind I described in the absence of a blue, the second big challenge is the position of military disadvantage in which the United States and its allies increasingly find themselves. People all the time talk about we can reduce the role of nuclear weapons because we are the world's only superpower. Well, we used to be. But the point of the National Defense Strategy Commission was we no longer have the forces to support a 2-war strategy. In other words, one in both Europe and Asia at the same time. So we can only do a 1-war strategy. That puts huge pressure on the region that would be left vulnerable. And we can only win in the 1-war strategy if the adversary gives us months and months and months of time to build up our conventional forces, because they all have to come from somewhere else. We don't enjoy conventional dominance anywhere in the world. We enjoy it after we're given time to assemble it. So can we really reduce the role of nuclear weapons further because we're such a dominant conventional power? I don't think so. The third emerging challenge to extended deterrence comes from the nuclear ban treaty. The leaders of ICAN are, they could not be more explicit than in saying that one of the primary objectives of the movement is to name and shame the beneficiaries of extended nuclear deterrence and to, quote, break the US nuclear umbrella. And when asked to defend this in the absence of bringing any name and shame to bear on Russia, China, or North Korea, they say, well, we have leverage where we have leverage and we're going to use it. Well, and there's a lot of pressure building on the European allies who are participating in the extended nuclear umbrella to get out of the business. Fourth challenge is the uncertainty about how to strengthen and adapt extended deterrence to deal with new challenges, and whether these get in the way of desired political improvements. And here, let's take the case of the Korean Peninsula. So the United States and South Korea and the United States and Japan have been slowly evolving the deterrence architecture in the region for 20 years in anticipation of the arrival of a nuclear-armed North Korea. That could be stopped at any time if North Korea stopped. But the three countries have cooperated on missile defenses. The two alliances have developed new strike capabilities, better ISR, and but then came the peace initiative of President Trump with the Kim Jong-un. And Kim Jong-un's price for, one of his prices for joining the discussion was a commitment from the United States and South Korea not to further strengthen the deterrence posture as a sign of good faith. While, of course, North Korea continued to strengthen its deterrence posture by continuing to turn out missiles and nuclear weapons. There is in each of our alliances an unending debate, as there should be, an unending debate about how do you balance political and military tools to reduce nuclear threats. And the case is always made that the practice of nuclear deterrence by the United States and its allies can be further modified to reduce the role of nuclear weapons. And this is a good example. This is a good leadership by example that will bring others along sooner or later. And it just hasn't happened that way. No one has followed our leadership by example on these questions. So nuclear deterrence is hostage to this division over how to balance political and military means of risk reduction. The fifth emerging challenge comes from, comes from rising demands in Northeast Asia for new forms, for improvements to the practice of extended nuclear deterrence. They make the case that the current US practice of extended nuclear deterrence comes from two decisions made in a very different and much more benign security environment. The decision was, first of all, the one I mentioned in 1990 to as a part of the presidential nuclear initiatives to withdraw all of the nuclear weapons from East Asia, which made good sense in 1990. And then in 2009, Michael and I participated in the decision to retire the Tomahawk nuclear cruise missile that was then still in storage and still then promised to the defense of our allies in East Asia. And instead, the Obama administration committed to retain an ability to forward deploy nuclear weapons with fighter bombers anywhere in the world in support of an ally anywhere. And that was also a much more benign environment. That was an environment in which there were no North Korean nuclear weapons and no missiles capable of reaching the United States. And so our allies in Northeast Asia rightly ask, well, how can that be good enough for today? And if North Korea continues to grow its nuclear arsenal, we're just going to fall further and further behind in terms of the balance of deterrence influence, goes their argument. And I think the deficiency of extended nuclear deterrence that's relevant here is not so much the one on the military operational side, although I think there is one, but I think it's on the political consultative side. So in NATO, allies who are anxious about the credibility of the nuclear guarantee coming from the alliance and from the United States, those allies participate in a consultative process. They participate in the debate about nuclear policy development. They're briefed on developments in the US nuclear posture. They make decisions together about the dual capable aircraft. And they understand that only the American president has the authority to employ US nuclear weapons. But they have, in the 1960s, participated in building the consultative process that would inform that presidential decision. So they wanted a seat at the table. They wanted to make sure that if the American president were deciding, that he would make the right decision, whether the right decision to employ them or the right decision not to employ them. And they knew that their voice would be heard by the president. So they can say they have a seat at the table. They can even say they know where the table is. It's in conference room 1 at NATO headquarters. Our allies in Northeast Asia have no nuclear sharing arrangements with the United States. They have no political consultative mechanisms with the United States at the defense ministerial level. And when they ask, where's our seat at the table, they don't even know where the table is. There is no table. I would be not assured were I one of those allies. Sixth and last, emerging challenge to extended nuclear deterrence is what it's not exaggerated to call a crisis of American credibility. Our allies could say to themselves, well, Trump is an aberration. He's pursuing an idiosyncratic agenda. He might want to withdraw from alliances, but the American public clearly supports alliances, which is true. But we, of course, all understand that Trumpism isn't going to go away, whatever happens to former President Trump. And that the antagonism to the unfair burden sharing and the tendency to see the alliances as vestiges of the past, not relevant to 21st century problems. This is a strong remaining current. And of course, it's not only felt in the Republican Party, where one of the common arguments about the sole purpose formulation of declaratory policy is, why should we let our allies veto our declaratory policy when it's our declaratory policy? If they don't like it, we just tell them that they should, and they will. Now, if I were an ally, I wouldn't find that very assuring. So my point is that our allies 3 years ago, 2 years ago, could say the pendulum's going to swing back and things will be okay. Now they're toying with the idea that the pendulum's not going to swing back, that it has swung in a different direction. And that, yes, the United States is likely to retain its alliances, but the expectation that the United States will lend its power to all of the purposes of its alliances is declining. And this is likely to lead to, well, likely to lead is the wrong way to put it. This increases the potential for a miscalculation by an enemy leader in time of crisis. And here we need to look no further than the 1930s, where the leaders of Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany believed that the democracies were weak, easily divided, led by weak people, and were so fearful that they would not defend their interests if those interests were attacked. And they looked for confirmatory evidence all along the way and found lots of it, made the choices they made, paid a terrible price because, of course, it turns out democracies are pretty darn resolved to defend their interests when attacked. But by creating a crisis of credibility, we reinforce the contemporary judgments of leaders in Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang that democracies are weak and easily divided and will not defend their interests if attacked. And that's the implication of the crisis of credibility, I think. So I see some pretty substantial challenges facing what I think is one of the main elements of our nuclear strategy, extended nuclear deterrence. And I wish I saw more signs that the incoming administration were seized with these questions and interested in engaging them. But so far, I have not seen that. So that leaves us a good chunk of time for some discussion. I hope that whet your appetite. I look forward to comments, questions, or comments masquerading as questions.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. I know that Daniel has been patiently waiting with his hand up for a while. Daniel.
Hi. Okay. Thank you. I had a question about. Oh, sorry about that. I was wondering about some of the details about the costs and benefits of the presidential nuclear initiatives in the 90s.
The general benefits and costs. I mean, the presidential nuclear initiatives occurred in two waves. There was a George H.W. Bush wave followed by Gorbachev, and then a Clinton wave followed by Yeltsin. And the initiatives were hugely successful in terms of changing the political relationship between Russia and the West, between the newly emergent Russia and the West, freeing Russia of all of that complexity of the mutual deterrence relationship, and went a long way towards reducing nuclear forces, taking them off of alert, reducing nuclear dangers in multiple ways, and reducing the burdens of residual deterrence functions. They were imperfectly complied with, and there's good evidence that Russia did not fully comply with the obligations that Gorbachev made for them unilaterally. That really doesn't erode their political value overall. There's a lot of discussion today about whether they could be replicated, whether instead of formal arms control measures. I mean, you can make the argument that the biggest changes in the nuclear relationship between Russia and the West occurred through these informal mechanisms rather than formal arms control. And so if today you're looking to make dramatic changes for the better in the US-Russian relationship, maybe what we really need is another round of P&Is. There's a good argument for that, but of course, the track record of Russia's compliance with its arms control obligations of the last decade is sufficiently troubling that I think people are not willing to trust that they would implement any new commitments.
Okay. If I could quickly say or ask another thing,
Sure.
It does sound like there is a good political value. I was actually wondering also about some of the economic value here. Is it something that like it creates more jobs than it costs in the maintenance versus the dismantling and disarming? Because it sounds like whether fully complied with or not on both sides, is there like a recycling of material and like workers to take apart these weapons?
Well, yes, arms control and dismantlement costs money. I mean, this was one of the big surprises to the Obama administration when it when we were finalizing the New START treaty. The Air Force said, well, here's your bill. And the bill turned out to be for a bunch of very reasonable things like trucks and cranes to move missiles from silos into storage facilities. Storage facilities had to be built because they didn't exist. And dismantling a weapon, well, that's the same workbench and the same people who assemble weapons. And you either have to double the workforce or reduce the rate of something. And so yes, there's opportunity cost to implementing arms control measures. But there's also a huge cost savings. One of my pet rocks right now is every time somebody says the Department of Defense is trying to modernize a Cold War nuclear force. Well, it's a tiny percentage of what was the Cold War nuclear force. And it's a lot less expensive to replace, well, 450 missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, than the 1,150 that were in place in 1990. There were 200 some nuclear bombers in the force in 1990. There are a fraction of that that would be available to the nuclear mission if it were ever required today, et cetera. So there is a cost savings in terms of the long-term cyclical cost of replacing aging weapon systems, a cost saving that comes from arms control.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. Who's next?
I know Arnold had a question. Arnold, are you there?
I'm here, but I thought you wanted me to not ask.
No, it's like the psychology one. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So earlier in your talk, you mentioned about the psychological credibility and extended deterrence. I was wondering if the lack of testing diminishes the psychological credibility of the nuclear deterrence and the extended deterrence, specifically over like the public perception.
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and I don't really know how to answer it. I mean, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't go back to nuclear testing just for the psychological shock it would provide to people, but it would provide a shock. I think in general, people have forgotten how destructive these weapons are, and how risky is a world in which they exist, and how dangerous would be somebody crossing the nuclear threshold. But I mean, people of my generation, for people of my generation, nuclear weapons had a certain visceral quality. We were joking earlier before the start of the session about I spent a few years as a kid in Malibu. Well, we did duck and cover drills monthly in our grammar school, because at the top of the hill next to the school was an office of the Rand Corporation, where they did nuclear strategy development, and it was assumed that they would be a target, and therefore there was a Nike missile site nearby with a nuclear weapon prepared for delivery atop that. The Nike missiles were our first anti-ballistic missiles, or second missiles actually. And so there was a certain visceral quality. Nuclear war was something that was present and conceivable. And I don't think for most Americans, nuclear war is present and conceivable. And frankly, that's just the way I like it. I wouldn't want the American public to be fixated on this problem, but that doesn't mean it's gone away. I think that what's required here is not a return to testing, but what's required is a political leadership that's willing to say, look, we're working very hard to make this problem go away, but it hasn't gone away. And if we get the answer wrong on deterrence, we're going to pay an awful price. So don't think that our pro-deterrence stance is pro-nuclear, but we need your support for nuclear modernization, just as we need it for our nuclear arms control. I think that kind of dialogue with the American public would go a long way towards sort of right-sizing our national anxiety about this problem, rather than a return to testing. Did that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Who's next?
Hello, Dr. Roberts. I got a question for you.
Sure, Preston.
Hey, if tomorrow the Biden administration said, we're not providing anybody any extended deterrence, you're on your own, among our allies, who would you expect to be able to make a domestic nuclear capability on their own? And how long would it take? And then I guess how long would the top five quickest countries take to make their own domestic capability? If you were to give a time frame.
Who's technically capable? is a function of expertise and technical capacity, and the availability of fissile material. Most of our allies have advanced nuclear power generation or advanced scientific research facilities. There was a point when I wrote on your question in about 1998 or 99, somewhere in there. No, it was a little later than that, 2003, I think, but where I was surveying the nuclear potential of US allies in East Asia, friends and allies, because Taiwan was a part of the discussion. And one indirect indicator I could find was there was then a list of the most recently exported supercomputers in the world, the last 500 exported supercomputers. 70% of those 500 exported supercomputers were in the nuclear power generation research facilities of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. I'm sure they were doing nuclear power generation research, but I'd be surprised if they weren't doing some other things as well. I think the reality is the only barrier to nuclear weapons acquisition for any country today is political will. Mostly the science of a nuclear weapon is no longer exotic. It's well known to most, not every element, but generally well known. The production skills for an entry-level device are not particularly exotic. Witness North Korea, which has done it with little money and a very tiny base of expertise. The Chinese regularly cite a report of the Rand Corporation, which I've never been able to find, but they say that the Rand Corporation says that Japan could produce from the decision to make nuclear weapons to 1 year later, it could have 144 nuclear weapons. I have no basis for knowing why they would say that, but Japan has an abundant supply of fissile material. And there's a technical dispute about whether commercial plutonium is viable as a weapons grade product or not. And you can take whichever side on that you'd like. And I don't mean to be cavalier. But Japan certainly has the engineering expertise. So I don't think there's an ally in the world of the United States that couldn't produce nuclear weapons fairly quickly if they had access to fissile material. Now, it's one thing to have a weapon, and it's another thing to have a secure second strike capability, to field delivery systems that would be survivable under attack. That's another matter, and that may be the harder part, and not really from an engineering perspective, but from a timeline perspective. If you're deploying you're developing a ballistic missile submarine fleet, and your neighbor doesn't want you to do that, well, there's a lot of time for that neighbor to attack the production infrastructure for the submarine, or to disrupt it by cyber means, or to kill the engineers, or so. If there were really a serious cascade of proliferation, we could go to a world in which half of America's current allies could have nuclear weapons in 7 years, I would guess.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts.
If you're interested in that subject of technical latency, the product I'm referring to was an Institute for Defense Analyses white paper entitled Nuclear Proliferation, and I can't remember the rest of it, but I co-authored it with my research assistant at the time, Alexis Blanc. And what we did was we established 4 thresholds of capability: entry-level, academic-oriented work aimed at just gaining an understanding of nuclear science. Next up, some real industrial capacity. Third, reprocessing of fissile materials. And then above that, the weaponization. And then what we did was we tracked over time the investment decisions made by allies to grow those capabilities. And there were clear waves and patterns. And just to drive the point home, at the end of the Vietnam War, every ally in East Asia moved from one category up one category, because they needed to be more strongly hedged against the possibility that they might need to design and deploy nuclear weapons in the event of a collapse of American political will, which seemed quite possible in 1975. Who's next? Mansook, you've nodded in agreement at many things that I've said. Where do we disagree? What did I say that you might disagree with?
I totally agree with you, as always.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm asking, because I'm not quite sure that's so.
So I have a question, Dr. Robert. So you primarily mentioned about the role of US nuclear weapons and US nuclear extended deterrence to its allies, but what should each allies do in order to increase the credibility of US extended deterrence? And if the credibility of US extended deterrence declines, then what is going to happen in the next?
Right. Well, I think the Republic of Korea and Japan have both moved in the right direction here by arguing that that deterrence is something for the alliance as a whole to do. There used to be a shorthand, particularly in the US-Japan alliance, that defense was the joint responsibility of Japan and the United States, but deterrence was America's responsibility. And now we're clear that conventional deterrence plays a role. So that allies have a big role, the central role in the conventional part of the equation. So the language has shifted from deterrence being something that America provides to deterrence being something that the alliance as a whole needs to support, and that we're jointly creating a regional deterrence architecture. I think that's the big idea, and it's moving in the right direction. So in any given period of time, there may be more confidence in America or less confidence in America, but so long as the alliance remains and it continues to adapt the regional deterrence architecture so that it's fit for purpose, then the risks that would come with weakened American resolve are mitigated somehow. But what happens if this crisis of American credibility grows worse rather than better? Well, what's going to happen is you all are going to live in a world of many nuclear powers, and there's going to be a perception of a great deal more nuclear risk and the reality of occasional nuclear use, I would expect, in limited ways, localized in regions. But I mean, the global nuclear order has proven very resilient, despite all of the hand-wringing for decades about how there could be a cascade, how there could be a tipping point, how much things could change, how the NPT regime could collapse. Most states have a very strong self-interest in not living in that world. And so I don't consider it likely that the existing international nuclear order will break down. But if President Trump is returned to the White House, and if he does withdraw from alliances, or if a successor who's Trumpian in character comes in and withdraws from alliances, And if that follows a period in which the Biden administration is seen to have ultimately chosen not to assure allies, it's chosen to put ideological interests ahead of their national interests, well, then I think we will see an unraveling, firstly in Northeast Asia. Yeah, I don't know how to put a silver lining into that future. I mean, I think the silver lining is then many more states will have a good reason to avoid nuclear war. And nuclear war will not be frequent, and if it occurs, will not be large scale. But I think, so we've gone, what, 70 years without the employment of a nuclear weapon. I think we're going to be very lucky to go another 70 without.
Dr. Roberts, I have a question about the Navy. So in the last few years, the U.S. Navy has been, increasingly used for freedom of operations, or FONOPs, and has been called on to spend huge amounts of time at sea. And I've heard, and though I'm not entirely sure if this is accurate, but that the Navy is being pushed to its limits in terms of its ability to continue to operate. Do you see that there are non-nuclear modifications to the US Navy fleet that could be valuable in assuring deterrence?
Well, non-nuclear modifications, the one that comes to mind would be well, two things come to mind. So my way of thinking about an answer to your question is to go back to the deterrence calculus. Deterrence being, the calculus being the balance of cost, benefits, and risks of different courses of action. And in strengthening deterrence, what we want to do is increase the adversary's expected cost of attacking us and reduce his expected benefit in attacking us. So if that's our objective, what can the Navy contribute to that? Through further adaptations to its capabilities. Well, one, it could provide a substantially more robust defense against missile attack. And maybe directed energy is going to provide some of the solution to that. Where the Navy's already experimenting with directed energy is for close-in anti-air combat. And maybe that could really tip the balance if we don't have to do hit-to-kill technology with missile defense, but could do directed energy protection of large battle fleets. That would go a long way towards negating China's confidence in its ability to impose cost on the US Navy. Now, what about imposing cost on China? Well, here I think regional range hypersonic strike capabilities make some sense. China and Russia are both deploying theater missile defenses, the S-500, and gaining confidence in their ability to withstand the cost we would seek to impose on them as a part of the deterrence calculus. If we can penetrate their defenses credibly, threaten to do so, then they can't contemplate attacking us without significant cost. So I think the Navy could up its game in the deterrence equation with those two capabilities. But to your broader point, or your starting point at least, yes, our Navy is way overcommitted. The American military is way overcommitted. This is in part because political leaders keep turning to the military and saying, here, go solve that problem. We don't have any political tools to solve it, so you figure it out. That's part of the problem. And part of the problem is we have obligations, we've self-accepted obligations around the world, and we don't want to pay for them. And, I see it in the nuclear business all of the time. The nuclear enterprise, of which I'm a part, is expected to, so the funding is well, was until last year, was relatively static over 30 years. And 30 years ago, the nuclear weapons complex was asked to do very little. Now it's being asked to do a lot. And what kind of financial support is it getting to do it? Well, last year it got an increase, but that was the first in decades. We Americans are told that our defense spending is excess to requirements. We're the world's only superpower. We don't need to spend all this money. We have strength enough. And I think our strength is inadequate to the obligations we've taken on. And either we need to shed some obligations or we need to increase our military and, more importantly, diplomatic capacity to deal with this world. So my 2 cents. Carl, I think you're up next.
Good. Thank you, Brad. Let's see. Let me take the conversation, since we have you for a few more minutes, in a little bit of a different direction, unless there's another question on extended deterrence. But I wanted your reaction. We haven't had a lot of time to sort of assimilate this, but the China-Iran deal, both economic and security, is interesting. It's very long range and very strategic, I think, from China's point of view. But they may be in the role now of being kind of the enablers for the sprint to the end for the Iranian nuclear weapon. The question is, given that the Koreans have been such a problem, I think, for the Chinese, do you think that the Chinese have actually thought this through? And to what degree do you think they have suasion on Iran ultimately in acquiring a nuclear weapon?
Well, I do think they've thought it through. I think they're very deliberative. We have seen in various track 2 and track 1.5 activities that I've been involved in, both a Stanford track and a Pacific Forum track. We've seen very clearly the depth of expertise and knowledge they have on both Iran and North Korea from the narrow technical perspective in terms of their nuclear capabilities, but more broadly in terms of the political context within which these countries contemplate their next steps on matters nuclear. And it's very clear that our senior interlocutors in Beijing on these questions have direct access to the senior levels of the Chinese government, which to me suggests that there's a long pattern of discussion underway at the leadership level about where to go. And I think we've sort of missed the sea change in Chinese grand strategy that occurred 4, 5, 6 years ago. And we see hints of it. Well, and it was fundamentally at the Party Congress in 2016. I think it was 2016. But we see in the nuclear area the new statements about seeking substantial qualitative improvements, fundamentally new strategic capabilities, quote unquote, and a strategic posture consistent with China's future emergence at the center of the global stage as the dominant power, quote unquote. And I think they've, and in the last 3 weeks, there have been repeated reports of speeches by Xi Jinping setting out the argument that to domestic audiences, that China's the rising power, America's the declining power. China presents a positive model to the world in terms of orderly democracy, and America presents a negative model as a chaotic, sclerotic democracy. And I think China's leadership aspiration is to unmake the American-led order and replace it with a Chinese-led order. And I wouldn't have said that. That wasn't my interpretation of things for a long time, but it's the hard line view I've come to. And I think they're playing the spoiler in Iran because they want to work towards a different outcome in the region. They want to have, well, let me make the point and then stop with just a very short story. And that's one of my early trips to Shanghai in the late 1990s. I found myself at a dinner table for the conference with fellow analysts, mid-career from the think tanks in Beijing. And I asked them what they'd been up to. And they said, oh, for the last 3 months, all of the think tanks working foreign and security policy in China had been given permission to study China's role in the Middle East, and particularly in the Persian Gulf, and make recommendations. And the basic question was, should China try to replace America as the dominant power in the Persian Gulf? Should they build a navy towards that end, et cetera? And they all said, of course, it makes no sense. There are so many headaches that you Americans have because of your role in that region. Why would we want those headaches? You look after the stuff, we'll derive the benefits. And I think they were telling the truth, and I think that way of thinking is gone. I think their view is America in these roles is not providing what China needs. And even if it were, it's not America's job to do that anymore. It's China's job. And they imagine, of course, a very different world order, one that's organized with deferential and respectful regional powers who kowtow to China. So I think they've decided to play the spoiler on Iran, and it's going to work out for the worst.
Thank you.
I think Arnold has a question about. I think he wants to make a comment about the project. I have one question after this. If you wanted to stay late, if not, I understand you not wanting to do that too.
No, I'm in no rush. I'm delighted, pleased to be able to interact with all of you.
Let's thank Dr. Roberts for his time before Arnold speaks. Thank you. Clap, clap, clap.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Arnold.
Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I asked to make this announcement. So tomorrow we're going to have a Zoom meeting regarding the project. It will be tomorrow at 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and we will be going through what we should be doing next. Please come, and all the additional information is in the Slack. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnold.
And a quick addition to that.
Yeah.
If you haven't contributed, or if someone in your group hasn't contributed, go ahead and message me on Slack or email me so that we can kind of make sure that credit is given where credit is due. And I appreciate all the work that everyone has done so far. It's really shaping up, but we're not quite there yet. So
I've taken
thanks, everyone.
I've taken a look at the document. It is shaping up. I've enjoyed reading it. Keep going, you guys. You guys are doing great. Anyhow, Dr. Roberts, I have a question about some of the language you've used, and I've asked this question before, and I can't seem to get an answer. Not to you, of course. You use words like calculus and optimization and all of these terms that imply like there is some sort of inherent mathematical way of going about this, and in the grand strategy game. But I have never been able to find any of it in any literature where they actually provide like, here's the optimization for deterrence, here's the actual function, here are like the variables, here's what you're trying to do. Like every time I sort of try and tinker with it, if my goal in sort of like a nuclear exchange is to like do economic damage to America, it's always like, well, let's hit Fort Knox. We don't kill anybody, but we wipe out the treasury of the United States. So like, and you'd only get that if you exposed like, here are the regions with the most treasure per unit area. And so I don't see any of this. Do you know where any of this is, or is this just not available, or not, people don't want to see it? Where is the sort of the actual calculus to back up the strategy policy, the strategy and policy.
Well, part of what you're encountering is the fact that it was done very aggressively in the McNamara period and discredited. So you can find the McNamara criteria and the logic behind them, which apparently you've done.
I've seen them, but they don't. I mean, like they fail for a variety of reasons. You know, they didn't have the systems engineering and the math and the computing power to actively do this. I mean, my phone is better than a Cray computer, so.
Well, the language about calculus of benefits, costs, and risks of different courses of action, that language all comes out of the joint operating concept for deterrence. So the joint operating concepts are formal documents crafted by the joint staff and blessed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And these are the main concepts that guide the development of plans and thus of capabilities. And the joint operating concept on deterrence, I think it's now called on strategic deterrence, was written in 2005 or 6 and has been updated once or twice since then. And that will set out some of the definitions and values. Actual application of analytic methods to bomb damage expectancy, that's another matter.
Not so much bomb damage expectancy. That's what the old calculations were. But you know, like that's not what the strategy is saying. It's saying what is the optimal game of deterrence to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons to 0, to reduce the amount of cost to 0.
Okay, so let me, before I lose my train, jump in and say for deterrence, what we're aimed at is in the adversary's mind, not his society or his geography. It's what we're trying to do is influence his expectation that the things he or she values can be put at risk. So there isn't a calculus of, well, I need to reach this threshold in order to really get that risk. There was in the Cold War, the single integrated operational plan, the SIAP. And the SIAP had a lot of that kind of thinking. The SIAP went away in the George W. Bush period. And what we have today can be fairly described as a playbook. It's like a National Football League team's playbook at the beginning of the season. It's not the playbook at the beginning of the week.
Okay.
And if you get into a mounting crisis, well, that's sort of like, okay, create my Monday morning playbook for next Sunday's game. It's not really a playbook, of course, it's a strategy. And maybe by Saturday afternoon, you've got a catalog of specific plays that you can put into motion in the game that support your overall strategy. But as you all know, at halftime, you have to adjust your strategy. And this is actually a very good analogy for nuclear war planning. So you're not going to find the kind of quantitative modeling or analysis of effects sufficiency. What you're going to find is different theories about how if I put this at risk or that at risk, I'm going to be able to persuade this person who's calculating doing this kind of damage to my interests to not do that damage.
All right, I don't want to take up any more of your time. I have follow-on questions to this.
Well, press it one more cycle.
Okay. If that's the case, then if I play a nuclear war game, how do I know who wins? So like we did a scenario with you last time, but there were no results. There's no results section of the, like if you published it, there would be no results section. You would have a, here's what happened. If we did it on a computer, we would say, we did this on a computer, we got this many outcomes, but there's no way to evaluate who won. And that means there's no optimization function, even with all of the small plays. And that is what frustrates me is, I mean, like just from, I can't, if there's no evaluation at the end, then I don't know. I also, I don't want to, again, I don't want to take, I know people have places to go, and I actually have to run to another meeting.
But in an escalating conflict, this is where Clausewitz becomes relevant.
I do love my class.
If war is a continuation of politics by other means, victory is that culminating political moment when somebody chooses not to run the costs and risks of further war. It doesn't matter quantitatively what the risks and costs are. What matters is their their relationship to the intent to act. So who won is a function of who didn't see the interest at stake.
All right, that actually makes, yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Well, I sort of got you an answer to your question.
Good enough. I do need to actually shut down this Morgan. I am sorry.
It is all
Morgan-
good.
All right.
Morgan, if you want, you can follow up by email to me, roberts86 at llnl.gov.